I came from a very oral background where everybody would share stories, and I really loved to read from a really young age. And poetry as a medium seemed to me like song form in literature somehow, and it just always really stuck. And no matter what other genres I write in, I always go back to poetry. It's very calming to me, it's very rooting and grounding, and I think it's very expansive. The poems in Rope were collected sporadically over 10 years. There were some years where I didn't write at all, actually. I think maybe 2.5 years in there I didn't write at all. But throughout those 10 years, in my 20s, I was really struggling with a lot of things a lot of people in their 20s do, with what I wanted to do with my life, and I wasn't getting good health care, and with relationship issues, and trying to figure out my place within my culture and my society, and feeling often like a failure. But poetry was always what really brought me back to a sort of sense, a sort of logic. There's some poems in there that are me interpreting a landscape that I'm in through my travels. In a very meta sense, Rope was my rope in my 20s, was like trying to create some sense through poetry, became what I held on to. I'm an artist and a writer first and foremost, because I don't want the work to be pigeonholed. I don't want the work to be seen as political propaganda first without being actual artworks. It's also interesting using the term activism, because I feel as though sometimes people put that label on those of us who just demand a certain level of respect for who we are. And also a lot of activism is unpaid labor, right, that is called activism. So you really have to question when people say like tireless activists. Actually, activists are tired. Sometimes, especially in the publishing industry, there are these boxes that books get put into, right? Feminist books, environmental books, books on disability. And I think what poetry can do is to show that actually every single issue is connected. There's no such thing as, a single issue life. Environmental issues disable communities and disable people and affect disabled people. Having access to stories across all deaf and disabled cultures is something that I'm really interested in. You hear constantly, right, you have to be the voice of the voiceless, or I am the voice of the voiceless. First of all, if you're not a speaking person, that's kind of problematic language. But B, who gave you the right? I think Arundhati Roy said there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only those who are deliberately, silenced or not heard. And it's really, I think that is very, very key, very, very true. When I was a teenager, I remember I would, interview people and write articles. And I remembered interviewing this blind woman and speaking about her with a sense of pity, because I didn't identify as disabled then, right? I didn't consider myself to be in a disabled body then. And I'm so mortified now. This is the narrative that is so pervasive in the UK of charity for deaf and disabled people, but also even women in general being spoken for or about. I think when you think of voice of the voiceless, you think of these huddled masses, usually brown, poor people that we have to save. And the savior mentality is just something that we need to get over. And, especially because I wanted to create indigenous species and other works as accessible to blind communities, being a seeing person, I thought that was really important, just to say, this is not an act of charity. I don't want to, give you something that you haven't already been advocating for decades and decades and decades. But just to say, because as a result of blind activism, I know that it's important for me to have, say, an ebook version of all my books that is accessible with a screen reader. That's something that I've been incredibly lucky to work with indie publishers who understand that ethos. The book, Stares and Whispers, isn't for able people. It's not to translate for able people. It's for us. It's to understand we have a community here of people who want to speak and write and create in our languages, in our ways of living, and I think that's really precious. I'm really proud of that book. It is addressing that pressure, to constantly translate for people outside our communities, and even within the deaf and disabled communities. Just co-editing that book and speaking to people, there are so many aspects of disabled and deaf lives that I had no idea, because we're so varied. I think it's powerful to say, this is my language, this is how we're going to speak about it, rather than being spoken for or written about in a way that often distorts what our actual experience is. I think that pressure is everywhere constantly, and you're constantly translating. There's a poet who just said, this isn't the Ojibwe language, and if you want to know what it means, here's a link to the dictionary. We're constantly supposed to know, for example, what Western culture is like, right? Whereas Western, it's not a monolith, but for example, a lot of people in Indonesia, where I'm from, know what people in New York might live like, whereas they might not even think about us. So to assert, this is my world, this is my community, and not thinking about, oh, but I have to translate it for outsiders, or I have to translate it for abled people, I think is super important. I think hopefully what poetry can do in relation to activism is, poetry is always a form of activism in some way, because just putting your voice out there, putting your stories out there, is a form of trying to create change. And B, that poetry itself can be valued, and poets can be valued. And then C, whatever else you put in your poetry that reflects, your ethics, that may not be a government's ethics, or it may not be a politician's ethics, or may not be what the mainstream media's ethics are. Pushing against that, I think, is a form of activism. But in the act of creating, I always try not to think about an action plan or deliverables, what have you, because you really have to focus on the art making. And if somebody appreciates that and perceives it as a form of activism, that's fantastic. Especially today, we're so focused on science and logic and a very westernized notion of what truth is and what facts are, and how to deny feelings sometimes. And I feel like as though writing, and it doesn't have to be about pain, obviously poems can be quite joyful as well, just even as somebody whose body is not respected by all segments of society uniformly, let's say, just saying, this is my story, here's a story, to me is important. It doesn't necessarily have to be about pain. It's actually quite radical to say, I'm here, I'm a human woman, person, writing a story of joy and expressing myself rather than letting society dictate for me what I need to express. I think that's powerful.